So welcome everyone. We're going to be covering food regulations today. So let's start with pizza. So these are two frozen pizzas, let's say, that you purchased. So which one do you think is regulated by the FDA versus USDA? Just throw out ideas, or both. This is frozen pizza you purchased at the store. So let's say this one, this is a cheese pizza. Who regulates that? Okay, how about that one? So why are you saying one or the other? What's the distinction between these two pizzas? Pepperoni. So USDA is the meat, right? So this pizza goes through 3 inspections from the USDA. This doesn't even go through an inspection. It just requires a food label, according to the FDA. So this is just to get your brain thinking about, okay, what am I making and where does it fall? All of today is going to be about what am I under, what are the things that apply to me, and how do I know they apply to me? So you got to keep things really straight. How about milk? Again, just throw out ideas. USDA versus FDA. I didn't know these before I looked them up, so don't feel like so. Okay, I'll tell you the answers in a sec. How about this huge seafood platter? Who knows? Packaged food, all packaged food. That's a category under one of those two. Any ideas? Okay. Eggs? Bottled water? It's under one of them. These are all under the FDA. Some of these also have the USDA as part of it, but all those things have rules that are largely under the FDA. If you look up FDA, these are their main list. This is just what they have. How about produce? Both. That's a trick question. Also FDA, and then also USDA. So a lot of these are overlap, but the key again is just to figure out which you're having to deal with. So this is sort of the sensation for people when they're like, oh my gosh, are you serious? So how do you sanitize lettuce? One of these is actually the right answer, or could be the right answer. Chlorine bath. Yeah. So this is just to bring up a really quick misconception that people have about food safety is that you can wash produce. You can chlorinate produce. That will actually deal with the pathogens. You can't wash it with soap and water if there's already pathogens on there and assume, with lettuce anyway, that that's actually addressing an issue. So you have to be really mindful about where your food safety protocols are being put in place. And the other interesting thing as producers is we don't get to say, well, we want the consumers to have more responsibility. A lot of it is on producers. A lot of it is on growers, unfortunately. So this, I like to bring this up. This is sort of a commercial cleaning step for lettuce. This looks super high tech because it is, and it's really, really involved. It's not what you have to do as a small producer. Like you certainly don't have to do this with your greens, but I bring this up because this is your competition. If you want to put a product on a shelf, and this applies whether it's mushrooms or anything else, if you want to put a product on a shelf, this is what you're going to be putting your product next to, is this kind of process. So you need to just keep that in mind because from a business standpoint, not as people, as humans, but they would love it if you made someone sick because then they can say local food is not safe. You need like really specific, high volume, commercially processed, bleached lettuce in order for it to be safe. That's the only way we prevent outbreaks. So keep that in mind as you're producing small local products. This is what you're next to on the shelves. So I hear this a lot. I eat my lettuce. Why does the FDA need to be involved, or USDA? Why do you think, why is that a bad argument? I eat my lettuce and I never get sick. Why is that a bad argument? Yeah, so your at-risk populations, so small children, older folks, people in hospitals, a lot of people are trying to get into institutional buyers, which are hospitals because it's a higher volume. So this is just one study, numbers on illnesses and deaths. This is the issue with that, is that just because your immune system can deal with something, you can't assume that that's true for everyone else. And a lot of growers that I've worked with before they actually start implementing these things, they say, I know my food is fine because I eat it. And I ask them, well, how do you then tell me how you know that you haven't made anyone sick, and you really can't, because unless you're taking those steps, then you're not actually guaranteeing that you're doing as much as you can. You won't always completely eliminate the risks, but the whole thing with food safety is mitigation. So an outbreak, 2 confirmed cases. How many of you have had a foodborne illness?
Sure, we all have.
Totally, yeah, but how many of you reported it? So, did you?
I called the restaurant.
Okay, yeah, that's common. So calling the person you think you bought it from. So a report would be health department. And most people don't even know that that's something you can do. The reason I bring that up is all these numbers are super low because these are reported, right? So an outbreak is 2 confirmed cases, so it's gone to the health department. But think about that. It's only 2 people that you've impacted with your food, but the community will not hear, oh, well, it's only 2 people. They just hear outbreak. That sounds really scary. And then you have, it depends on which studies you look at, but 4 to 5 years recovering with a huge marketing campaign, recovering local trust again in whatever your product is. So that's sort of the transition time. So in addition to being safe, the responsibility, especially of local producers, to help maintain that trust is huge. Even if you don't feel like, well, none of these things apply to me, we'll look at all the regulations. If none of them actually legally apply and legally you can do nothing, this is what you want to come back to and say, well, do I want people to buy my food? Local trust is priceless, MasterCard. Okay. So despite all that, you can totally do this. It's very possible. You have to do a little bit of work up front. But if you figure these things out, get things in line, and then set up your processes correct, you can absolutely do this on a really small scale without a ton of like huge $1 million stainless steel machinery. So it's very, very possible. Even if you're told you shouldn't, I added this in here because so some of the trainings I've taken, depending on who I've taken them from, they say if you're considering putting vegetables in your manufactured product, which is funny to say manufactured food, but if you're considering putting vegetables in that, then try and do everything you can to take vegetables out because they're dangerous. And that's the message that you'll hear. But that's again, it's totally possible. You just have to be careful about how you're doing things. So just be mindful. If you're hearing that message, certain groups will say that more than others. Just keep that in mind. It's totally possible to do this. Okay, one more thing before we jump into regs. Selling to stores, so you're going to be dealing with department managers. Again, this is the idea of putting your product next to others. Shipping, packaging, labeling, locally owned versus nationally owned. So department managers are the ones you're going to interface with probably. You want to go to them, and you have a chance, especially because you'll have a better sense from today of the regulations, you can shape the conversation oftentimes. If you go to them and say, here's the regulations I've looked at, here's the ones I know I have to comply with, here's how I'm complying, here's the ones I'm not complying with, and here's why, they probably won't know all the regulations that you're talking about. So you can shape that conversation, and oftentimes you can say, look, here's what I want to be our agreement about food safety, and here's why. And that's possible oftentimes at locally owned stores because they don't have a corporate structure that's saying, here's what you have to do as far as food safety. If you get into nationally owned stores, or distribution companies, so Cisco, FSA, Walmart, Costco, I've seen it at Super Ones a couple times in Montana. They may have corporate policies that say you have to have this sort of food safety program from all your buyers. And part of the reason for that is things have changed on the buyer side, and now they're saying, well, you have to have a supplier verification program, which means essentially they want to know more about you as the person they're buying from. And that's a little bit of a gray area for them, so they still have to set what that means for them and what they're comfortable with, but that's what you might run into. And then just a quick note about packaging and things. So this is what coolers and things look like. You want to keep that in mind. Your ability to maintain their food safety plans as you bring things in. So that means like not having dirt on your boxes. Some of you that probably doesn't matter. But just being mindful of how they operate and then helping them sort of integrate because they're used to getting a pallet full of really nicely saran wrapped stuff and it's all in plastic bags or whatever it is. So you have to work with them in a way that doesn't make them essentially frustrated. I've seen that with people trying to sell to these stores. You know, the produce manager, whoever it is, says, okay, let's try it out. Like, see how it goes for a season, and then it's just frustrating for them. You know, like their daily unit of operation is a box. If you can't stack the boxes, they're not going to work with you. So keep these things in mind. Okay, so we'll get into regulations. The way I want to do this is I'll ask you guys questions. We'll go through a list of 10, and I'm going to have you write down regulations that may apply based on your answers to these questions, and then we'll go through the regulations. Okay, so we'll ask questions first, and then we'll go through the regulations that are applying. So just keep a list, if you would, of and I'll give you the list after each question of things that may apply. And then we'll go through and we'll make sure that you have a sense of whether or not they actually do apply. And I'm sorry if this is hard to see. I can't turn the light off because of the video. So do you transport produce from out of state for retail in Montana? Retail is sale to end users, so you're not selling bulk to a grocery store. And produce is specifically defined. But I don't think any of you guys are probably doing this. Is that true? Okay. So I'll just really quickly, again, I'll give you a list of regulations that we'll touch on later, but this would be what would apply. So Montana Produce Program, we'll talk more about that. Mushroom GAP, which we'll get into with you on another question. Harmonized GAP, Food Safety Modernization Act, that's FDA. And again, these are very acronym heavy. I'll go through all these and make sure that they're straight. But we don't need to worry about that list since none of you guys are doing that. Import or export seed potatoes, probably none of you guys are doing that, I would imagine. So not that list. Do you produce and sell honey? Any thinking about it? Okay, so if you're thinking about that, so I would just jot down DPHHS, Department of Health and Human Safety, and that's Montana's state. And we'll divide up the regulations, local, federal, and then international. So that's a state one. But just, again, jot these down and we'll sort of make sure they're all clear later. FDCA is the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act. We'll touch on what that means. So that may, again, these may apply. We'll create a list of what may apply, and we'll make sure you understand whether or not. And then GFSI is private and federal. GFSI is Global Food Safety Initiative. It's a very voluntary program usually, but it's international. It's kind of the biggest scale, the highest standard. Okay, so that's honey. Do you make cottage food products? Do you guys know what cottage food products are? Okay. So we'll jump to a list. So if you're not sure if you're producing them, keep that for a second. We'll get back to that list. But if you're producing those, the DPHHS, so that's State Department of Health, the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, and then maybe GFSI stuff. So again, just jot those down. And if you already have these on your list, you don't need to duplicate. This probably won't apply to you guys, but the USDA has a GAP program. GAP means Good Agricultural Practices. This is common when people want to use GAP, the USDA GAP, but they are having trouble, they're not really sure how to do it. So people sometimes come together and do a group GAP program. That's something the USDA put together where a group of 10 growers, a group of 10 producers go through the program together. You can write a common food safety plan. If it works, you can share the cost of buying things that are related to that, like plastic liners for boxes, whatever that might be. Probably none of you will have that as part of what you're doing, I imagine. Yep. Yeah, so I worked a lot with the Western Montana Growers Cooperative, who was part of the USDA pilot study for Group GAP. And it's nice with cooperatives because the cooperative can be sort of the central hub and the person that manages that program. And that was pretty effective. They found that some of the cost sharing wasn't quite there. Part of the idea there is that not all of your members have GAP audits. Only a select few do, and then if they pass, everyone in the group passes. But the cost of running the program was kind of offset that because they still had to pay someone to run the group GAP program. So it's a possibility. And maybe if mushroom growers at some point got to where they wanted to work together, that would be an option. But again, the thing with group GAP is you have to work together. So you have to be in a group that works, and you can agree on what you're going to do. So that list won't apply. So I'm going to bring this up, Perishable Ag Commodities Act. When people hear this, they think of this. They think of perishable and rotting food. It has nothing to do with that, unfortunately. It's kind of confusing. It has to do with business disputes. This is an act that's meant to help people, producers and buyers, deal with disputes between buying and selling produce. I bring it up because I've actually seen it being used by Walmart, Cisco, and Costco. And they send growers these huge legal documents, which is unfortunate because they don't understand them oftentimes. And they say, sign this or we're not going to buy your produce. And if you go through it, essentially what it says is, if there's any issue, if there's any recall for any reason, it's on the grower to pay for it. They pay for all the cost that wasn't sold. They pay for the process of the recall. For the people that are involved in that, they pay for their time. So essentially it puts a lot of burden on the farmer. And I mean, it makes sense from Costco's standpoint. If something was wrong, they didn't want to have to be responsible for it. But oftentimes, it seems like that goes a little bit farther than I think is reasonable to ask the farm to be willing to accept. But that's kind of their option, or they don't sell to that buyer. So just keep that in mind. If you see that, just keep that in mind what it is, because it might come up at some point, potentially. And that's the only one PACA is that applies to that. Are you a producer? So this is, again, getting back to those cottage foods. These are kind of the main categories. So honey, dried fruit, jams, herbs and spice mixes, popcorn's on there. There's some weird ones like popcorn and cotton candy, breads. So if you don't see your items on this list, are you seeing everything? Or what you're making? Okay. Is anyone not seeing anything that they're making or thinking of making?
This is like what you did. All of our different producers are doing a lot of similar things like that. I'm doing a couple of them.
Okay. So this is the cottage food rule. The nice thing is that it's a specific list and it's regulated at the state. This, don't worry about reading all this, but this is the exhaustive list. This is the rule itself. So if you need to look through and see what's on here, that is the DPHHS rule, and you can find that online. So again, this is going back to that question about food products. Same idea, same list here. So the things that would apply are the Department of Health rules, maybe HACCP, which is Hazard Analysis and Critical Controls, which again, I'll go through later. Food Safety Modernization Act Preventive Controls Rule. So we call that FSMA, Food Safety Modernization Act. That's the up-to-date FDA rule. And again, I'll sort out the regulations, but just really quick, the FSMA rule, Food Safety Modernization Act, has 7 parts. One of them is produce, and one of them is preventive controls. The others aren't something I've dealt with as much. They're things like anti-terrorism and animal food. So we'll mostly just deal with produce rule and preventive controls rule. Produce is farming, and preventive controls is when you start manufacturing, cutting, cooking, slicing, dicing, things like that. And then Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, you'll find that this is sort of a catch-all, and we'll go over what that is, and then maybe Global Food Safety Initiative. I always throw this on here because it's possible that a buyer would say, I want you to do something that's in line with this. It's going to be voluntary. There's nothing legally that requires you to do it. But someone like Costco might say, well, we need you to be audited under GFSI standards. That's kind of when that would come into play. Okay, so next question. Do you or will you produce and sell juice products? Anyone? Probably not. So that's really great. They're really hard to produce. These are some of the machines that you can use to do that. It's very high risk because you're essentially creating a really great environment for bacteria. So the Mission Mountain Food Enterprise Center, just as an aside, they bring in folks who do trainings on food safety. They're trying to get someone to do juice HACCP. Juice HACCP is a specific category under the FDA list of HACCPs. And HACCP, again, is Hazard Analysis Critical Control Point. Essentially, it's a program where you look at your hazards and you deal with them. And under that, juice is an entire category because it's really hard to produce safely. It's possible, but we won't go through that list since you guys aren't doing juice. So this, again, this is sort of everyone will be under this list, I imagine. So do you retail or wholesale produce in Montana, except maybe you, Barb? Retail is direct to consumer. Wholesale is you're going to an intermediate like a grocery store, and produce is defined based on this. So this is the longest list. So Montana Produce Program, MTPP, we'll talk about that. Department of Health stuff might apply. Again, these may apply. We'll go through if they do. All the GAP programs, so there's different GAP programs under the USDA side. The FSMA produce rule, depending on your sales level, and we can go over whether or not that applies to you. HACCP might apply. Preventive controls, if you're retailing something that you're adding value to. Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, and then maybe, again, GFSI if your buyers are asking for that. I'll give you guys a sec to write those down. So do you guys have a general sense now of what may apply to you? And now we'll go into the details about what those are. Okay. Any questions so far on that list of questions and what may apply? Okay. So this is the last question. It's not quite a question, but so you are required, this is the FDCA, Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act. That was sort of originally what gave the FDA the ability to regulate food. And you're required to to produce safe and correctly labeled food. So the other thing you'll hear is unadulterated food and correctly labeled. This is really broad idea. Basically, you can't produce something that's going to make people sick, that you know is going to make people sick, and you're not taking action to prevent that. The reason I bring this up, again, is this sickness idea that you can make people sick, and there are repercussions for that. So one of those, this is the listeria outbreak in Colorado. This was the first time someone was found criminally liable for producing something and selling it that made someone sick, and there were deaths associated with that. So that was a little bit of a shift as far as food safety rules and what people were liable for, but just keeping that in mind. It's nothing to scare you. Again, that was a really big case and a big deal, but it has been sort of set as a precedent now that's out there and it's a possibility. Okay, so again, I really want to emphasize that's the list that may apply to you. So now we'll figure out if they do, and if they don't, again, keep them on your list and maybe write a description of why they don't, because again, you can shape your conversations with buyers and say, well, look, we've done a pretty good review of a lot of regulations, and even if none of them apply, you can say none of these apply because X, and that's really useful to go to a buyer and say that. So we'll start with local. Oh, that's super hard to see. I'll just make sure, if you can't read something, let me know. Raise your hand and I'll make sure I shout it out. So local, so Montana scale, we'll do local, federal, and then global regulations. That's how I'll kind of chunk it up. And federal, and then global, international. So the local side, the Montana Department of Ag has regulations that are relevant, and then also Montana Department of Health and Food and Consumer Safety. So the two things we'll look at, the Montana Produce Program. So if you have MTPP on your list, that's what we'll look at. And then if you have Montana Food Safety Law or DPHHS, we'll look at those two things separately. The Montana.gov, the agriculture website, has a lot of good resources on this. They have a whole food safety section. So that's a good place to go for this. They also have part of that, not in the food safety section, but part of their website is the produce program. So anything that's within this realm is a good place to go is the state website. So looking at the Department of Ag website, or the Department of Ag rules first, mostly it's the Montana Produce Program. So they give produce licenses if you're at a certain sales level, which I'll put up here in a sec. That's going to apply to you. They also do the seed potato inspections, basically import-export inspections. They check on that. And there's two folks that are doing that now. Lori out of Missoula, who just took Dan Poff's position, and then Larry Crum, who's more of the eastern side of the state. The nice thing is that they're super knowledgeable about Montana agriculture, and they'll do a lot of the inspections. They'll do USDA gap audits as well. They just kind of that's part of their job now. So they'll be the ones that show up to your farm if you're doing USDA stuff. They are super nice, super reasonable. They understand what it's like to be a small grower in Montana, and they work with people. They're not gonna do anything that's outside the law, but they make sure that if growers need to understand something while they're doing an audit, they're really clear about what needs to change if something needs to change. So just keep that in mind. These aren't rules that are being enforced by people who are malicious and trying to put small growers out of business. Larry and now Lori are really, really reasonable folks. So it applies to wholesale produce in Montana. If you transport produce from out of state for retail, which won't be any of you guys, and then if you retail over 25,000, so that's pretty low. Technically, if you sell at a farmer's market and you are over that gross sales, you should have a produce license from this program. A lot of people don't, and again, it's not like Larry's walking around the farmer's market going, let me see your produce license, but technically you should. What he does do sometimes is he just walks around and tells people about the program. He doesn't ever ask to see the license. But the idea here is that it helps them monitor what's going on. Yeah, question. Larry Crum, K-R-U-M. You can definitely find him on the state website. Probably. He's super active. Yeah. Yep. So just keep that in mind. You may have that produce program license as a requirement. So jumping back to our list, so Montana Department of Health. So we'll get into that now. So each state is given the authority to write its own food regulations. Again, this is really nice because we know what we do and we can sort of provide regulations that match that. That covers farmers markets, cottage food products, mobile food, retail, and retail establishments. So again, this is where you need to understand what you fall under, where you're selling physically, how much you're selling, and the products will all give you this definition. If you need it to, we can go into into these sort of categories more at the end. I don't think I break them down, but there's a great part of the Montana Department of, or montana.gov website is specifically cottage food rules. There's a lot of good FAQ stuff, a lot of sections on how to figure out where you're at. There's one specifically for honey, so just keep that in mind. A few more things on this. This rule also regulates the county sanitarians. So as soon as you're in like a commercial kitchen, as soon as you're producing that sort of value-added product, the county sanitarian becomes involved. We're going to be coming in and doing inspection of your commercial kitchen. So just keeping that in mind. County sanitarians, you'll see them oftentimes at farmers markets too, looking at people who are selling processed food. So again, you need to know where you're at, what you fall under in terms of retail, wholesale, mobile food establishments. And all that is on the DPHHS site. We can look at that more if we have time. So federal regulations. So that was local. We'll jump into federal. We'll keep these based on FDA and USDA. So here's our list, and we'll do one at a time. And then I'll combine a couple of them. So GAP, Good Agricultural Practices. This was the program that the USDA set up really initially to deal with food safety. It's been the industry standard for a long time. And there's an audit program associated with this. You can have someone come out and look at your farm. You get a score. If you get above an 80%, you pass. And then you're actually listed on the USDA website as having received a GAP audit. Up until recently, this was something that FSA, Costco, those folks were asking for. Some local food stores were asking for them, but that kind of was depending. So the USDA has whole pages on each of these things. Those are really good resources. They have the score sheets, the audit sheets right on there if you want to look through those. There's also a series of videos that I made with ATRA, or they're posted through ATRA. They were made in conjunction with NCAT. And this actually shows you, we filmed like an audit, so you have a real clear sense of the kinds of questions that are asked, so that it's a little bit less intimidating. The audits, they sound kind of intimidating, but they really aren't. At least in Montana, they're very straightforward, and Larry and Lori, again, are great people to have come out. The steps to this, you need training. You're required to do some sort of training. You have to write a food safety plan, so you need a big piece of paper or small if you can really describe adequately. But in the score sheet, it will say specifically, in your food safety plan, does it have this sort of, do you talk about this? So it tells you what has to be in there. And there are templates if you need those, so you don't have to start from scratch. You can do a self-audit, that's optional, where you score yourself. You can do what's called an internal audit, where someone who's trained to do that can come out and do that before the USDA audit. The nice thing about the internal audit is it's not public record. The USDA audit will be public record, so if you fail, then it is, but just keep that in mind. And then you request a third-party audit. That's what they call the USDA audit when they come out and do that for you. And then final step, you're listed on the USDA webpage. So jumping back to our federal list, we'll go into group GAP. I talked about this just briefly, but the Western Montana Growers Cooperative did this. There's great resources and sort of guidebooks on how to go through that whole program, including the USDA's version. It's not as colorful, but they have a guidebook if you're ever interested in that. There's really clear outlines about how to do that. Part of that is actually creating a quality management system. And that, again, like I said, there was a cost associated with running the program. The quality management system is the biggest part of that, is just actually creating this document that controls your documents and how you do everything. So it's pretty involved, but that information's out there if you need it. So tomato and mushroom, I'll do these together, but mushroom GAP will certainly be something you might look at then. Again, there's whole web pages on these through the USDA website. And then I just wanted to add, United Fresh Association, they are often bringing in these policy sort of influences. You'll see a lot of the things that USDA and FDA sort of take from as far as what they're doing comes from the United Fresh organization, and that's sort of this interplay of industry and federal regulations. There's a lot of that going on, and that's why you have things like tomato and mushroom GAP, because the USDA said, we're going to do GAP, here's our main system, and then tomato and mushroom growers said, these things really don't make sense for us. We do things differently, and this is true now of like potatoes and things. And so there's always going to be this interplay of industry and regulations, and especially where groups can form, not necessarily group GAP, but where groups can form and give feedback on these. USDA, FDA, even the Montana Department of Ag, they've all shown some flexibility on implementing and writing these regulations, which is kind of nice for growers to be able to give that feedback. So jumping into Harmonized GAP, and I'll include Harmonized GAP Plus. The only difference between these two, Harmonized GAP Plus is has been submitted to the Global Food Safety Initiative, which is the international scale, which we'll talk about. Basically, they wrote Harmonized GAP, and then people said, we want to be able to do this audit and not have to do a second one for at an international scale. So what you can do is you can submit any audit program. You can submit that to GFSI, and they can say, yeah, it's basically the same as ours, so we're comfortable with that. And if it's listed from them, then essentially it's equivalent, and you can just do the one audit. That was the idea, is just to have one that people go through. So Harmonized GAP, really quickly. So this is the USDA GAP. This is prior to Harmonized GAP. This is the score sheet. Don't worry about reading it, but then this is Harmonized GAP. What I like about Harmonized GAP, there's more text, so you have to read more, but it's really, really specific. And it tells you corrective actions, so if something's wrong, it tells you what to do. Verification is exactly what the auditor will look for. And then procedure and requirements, the requirements is essentially the rule. Procedure is what you would have to do. So I like that because it's super specific. This, you get one sentence, and then you kind of have to figure it out. And then there's a separate auditor guide that maybe you find, maybe you don't, and the auditor shows up, and you're like, well, how do you know that you're asking for that versus I just have this one sentence? So Harmonized GAP is nice in that way. If you're going to start with a food safety plan, I would recommend Harmonized GAP. There's also templates for Harmonized GAP. So if you need to start doing either of those things, you don't need to start from scratch. There's a lot of resources out there. I'll mention really quickly audits in Montana. The cost is going up. This is not something that we set as a state. The cost is $114, I think, or $104 per hour. And that includes the driving time, a desk audit time. And the desk audit now is a minimum 4 hours, or the audit is a minimum 4 hours. And the reason was we had a lot of people like Larry and Lori who were saying, oh, it only took me an hour to do this whole thing. And it used to be $98 an hour. And the USDA said, well, we can't find our program because everyone's sort of fudging those numbers, and we don't have enough money to actually fund it. So that's why they put the price higher, and there's now a minimum 4-hour audit time. So if you want to go through this program, if a buyer says, we want you to do Harmonized GAP, keep in mind it's probably going to be like $500 to $1,000. Like you can assume that'll be a cost, so make that part of your consideration. Again, all the USDA stuff is voluntary, so you do have a choice of whether or not you're trying to go in that direction. And again, there's a template if you need that. Going back to our federal list, Perishable Ag Commodities Act, I know I touched on that already. Again, it's just a method of disputing business disagreements, and there's even a nice form that you can fill out. And I mentioned corporate use of this for liability. That's something that people have run into. So jumping over to the FDA side, so again, Food Safety Modernization Act, that's the most recent act that was passed by the FDA, sort of modernizing their food safety rules. Produce rule is mostly going to obviously deal with produce. The Montana Department of Ag puts on trainings a couple times a year, and I have the book if you want to look at that. It goes through all the things that you need to have associated with that. So steps to this, find out your compliance requirements. So based on your sales level, you have to comply or not, and there's different dates. If you want to go through that, we can go through that afterwards. But basically, whatever you're selling and who you're selling it to will determine how much of this is relevant to you. For a lot of small growers, some of it you'll be exempt from some of it or all of it. So just keep that in mind. You need to do a grower training. If you take a GAP training, that has been considered equivalent, but there's also, again, the ones that Montana Department of Agri provides. And then you need to essentially, that's all you have to do. You can do on-farm readiness review where the Montana Department of Ag comes out and essentially it's not an inspection, there's no note-taking, there's no points, there's no score. They just help you understand if you can improve on anything. It's actually a really nice service for growers. Whoops, sorry. On-farm readiness review, or you'll hear OFRR. That would be a good one for you, Ben, probably. And then an inspection is not guaranteed or required. So if you go through this whole process, there's no like certificate that you get. You're just doing it well. You may at some point have someone from the Montana Department of Ag come out. The FDA is not coming out to your farm. There's an agreement between MDOA and the FDA, and they said, we're going to let you guys do it, which is great. So no one from the FDA, you'll have maybe someone from the Department of Ag come out. But they're going to rank that based on the size of the farms and the risks associated with those farms. So if you're showing up to these trainings, if you're participating in OFRRs, you're probably going to be lower down the list of the inspections. And even then, the inspections explicitly are educational the first time. There's no The only time that they're going to have any issue is if there's something called an egregious condition, which is what it sounds like. It's really, really serious, and obviously something that's contaminated is going into sale in the market. But I've actually never seen that on a farm. So FSMA produce rule and resources, just really quick. The Produce Safety Alliance, which is with Cornell, they created this curriculum. There's a lot of good resources that are specific to FSMA produce rule. Again, don't worry about reading this, but the actual rule itself, the rule comes in a handbook if you want it, which you can see up there. This is what I reference when I want to look something up. It's pretty straightforward and nice to have. It's a small version of the rule. So there's that, and there's a preamble to this. The preamble is comments that were submitted and then responses. So if I can't figure something out when I go through the actual rule, the legislative text, I go to the preamble, and I put this up here, Control F, which is find on a computer. That's your friend, because this document is like 1,000 pages. It's like 3 years of comments and 3 years of responses. So it's huge, but it's still useful as something that you can look for clarification. And so this is basically everyone who cared to submitted comments on the original rule. And then the FDA said, I like this one because it says, we disagree with the suggestion. So sometimes they're like, yeah, I see your point, but we disagree. And sometimes they say, yeah, that's a good point. We're going to make this adjustment. And it says right in there what they changed. So especially around water, the FDA is still looking at how they're going to do water stuff. There isn't a final rule on irrigation water, essentially, right now. So that's in the comments. There's a lot of clarification about essentially how they're thinking. And that's nice to find. And that's just another, that's the preamble essentially over there as well. Okay, jumping back to our federal list. So HACCP is what was around before the preventive controls rule, but they both deal with creating value-added products. So if you're creating something other than just what you've grown, you're going to get into these two things. So HACCP, this is right from the FDA page. So here's their dairy HACCP. They have, again, like I said, a specific juice HACCP, seafood, retail, and food services. So what you're doing with HACCP is you're looking at your hazards, and then you're going critical control point. So what is the point in my production where I need to control that hazard? They have a whole structure of how they want you to do this, but that's something that you might run into. So Barb, that would probably be very applicable. So this is what seafood plant with a HACCP plan looks like. Again, you don't have to be this high-tech and fancy, but you're going to be asked to look at like flow of products through your work area, cleaning and sanitation practices, all these kinds of things that could be hazards, and then how you control them. This is what it looks like at a Hutterite colony. So Hutterites that I've worked with, they do canning of their goods, and they are required by their counties to write HACCP plans for them. But this is, I put this up there because it's an example of a local producer creating a value-added good with a HACCP plan that's been successful. So you can totally do it, but it just requires that work ahead of time. And you'll notice things like none of these things are on the ground. All the bins are off the ground. I mean, there's really kind of simple, but things that need to happen in order for this to be implemented correctly. And then there's some folks at the farmers market with their canned goods. So jumping back, so I'll combine these two last ones from the FDA. So preventive controls, this will get a little bit into the weeds, but it may be useful for you, so we can go into it. So think of these as three parts. CGMP is current good manufacturing processes, hazard analysis, and then risk-based preventive controls for human food. So this is all under the preventive controls rule. And then it gets a little bit weird, but you can have exemptions to this, which may apply. So if you're required to register with Section 15 of the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, these apply to you unless you have an exemption. The preventive controls rule applies unless you have the exemption, and I'll talk about the exemption. So I'm just going to pull out chunks of this because this is a lot of detail. So here's all the things I want to pull out, and I'll do them one at a time. So first, required to register with Section 415 of FDCA. So what does that mean? So FD&C covers all these things. This is just a general list of what that covers. So keeping in mind, and it also has Title 21, which I mentioned, which is the adulterated food issue. So Section 415, why a facility has to register Basically, they're keeping in track of everything that everyone that's selling food, distributing food. So if there's an issue, they can deal with it. What it costs, there's no fee for that. And what facilities, so this is important, domestic and foreign manufacturers and processors, foreign packers, foreign storage operators. So mostly manufacturing and processing. That's going to be where people are under 415.
So section 415 is required for all food processors? Or
So the preventive controls, thanks for asking because this is confusing. So the preventive controls rule, which is part of FSMA, you have to comply with that if you are required to register under 415, which is this. So if you're manufacturing and processing food, you have to register under section 415, unless you have an exemption, which I'm about to go into. Okay, but if you're not under the exemption, then preventive controls applies. So let's jump into the exemption really quick. So again, this is in the weeds, but super important to understand whether or not this applies. So this subpart, which we're talking about, this is the exemptions, does not apply to the following facilities. Foreign, which isn't relevant, so farms. So farms obviously don't have to deal with preventive controls. Retail food establishments, you're not under there.
Wait, so farms don't have to deal with preventative foods?
Preventive controls, because remember you're talking about manufacturing. Farms are under the produce rule.
So this is more about processing?
Yeah, yep.
Okay.
Yeah, good clarification. Fishing vessels, nonprofit food establishments, and restaurants. So if you're a warehouse or if a factory making processed food, you're not going to get this exemption. You don't need to worry about all this text, but just keep in mind that all of these things have really specific definitions. So farms, this is the definition of a farm. Retail food establishment, this is the definition of that. So if you're not sure if you're one of these things, you can look that up really specifically and figure that out. And I'm happy to do that, but I won't go into that much detail right now. So going back to our list, so we talk about 415, we talk about exemptions, which may apply to you. So looking at CGMPs, whoops. Oh. I've forgotten that slide, sorry. So CGMPs are specifically from the preventive controls rule, and they're the standard for manufacturing processes. And that's what you're going to be adhering to under the preventive controls rule if that applies to you. And you can look that up on the FDA site. And then risk-based preventive controls. So the Montana Manufacturing Extension Center, so I did their training with them. They have this whole booklet that tells you what that means. All this is included. And essentially, it's like the produce safety training, but it's all based on you're in a building now and you're processing, you're chopping, baking, whatever the case might be. So that's a really good resource for you. They have essentially a couple categories that you want to look at, and it's HACCP, and it's also an allergen program, and then also a supplier verification program. So those are the kinds of things that you'll get into with manufacturing. Questions? I know that was kind of into the weeds a little bit, but basically you want to keep in mind there's this preventive controls thing. If you have to register, which is separate anyway, if you have to register under 415, that preventive controls applies, unless you have that exemption. And then these are the three things that you're looking at, CGMPs and risk-based preventive controls. Those are really defined, and it's a set of processes that you have to implement when you're making those items. Okay. So international regulations, so we're done with federal. So jumping up to international, I've mentioned GFSI a couple times, Global Food Safety Initiative. The idea with GFSI is they said, okay, everyone's getting all these different audits. Some people are having like 5 or 6 audits a year with essentially the same material. And the joke always is, E. coli doesn't know if it's under the USDA GAP audit or the FDA audit. Like it's just E. coli. So why can't we just have one? And that's what producers and manufacturers were asking for. So they tried to get everyone together at the same table and come up with one audit standard. Unfortunately, Primus didn't show up. Primus is a huge safety auditor and sort of program distributor. So there's still a little bit of separation there, but essentially you have, and you can see just from their websites, like the world's largest collaboration for food safety, and then Primus, a global food safety initiative scheme, and they're both kind of like, we're the one, we're the main deal. But again, it's too bad that there isn't one, but you might have growers who run, or you might have buyers saying, we want Primus because that's what we're comfortable with, that's what we're familiar with. Or you might have someone saying, we want GFSI. So you just kind of have to keep those separate. And unfortunately, there's still those two that are out there. And then Harmonized Gap Plus, I mentioned this, but that, again, has been submitted to GFSI, and GFSI said, yeah, we're comfortable with that. That's the same. So the way that looks is, Costco will come to you and say, or they actually have like an online website, your profile, and it says, you get a little notification, and it says you need to update your food safety certification, and it needs to be GFSI equivalent. And then until you get that document from the USDA that says you've passed Harmonized Gap Plus and upload that, then you're not in compliance and you can't sell to them. So that's kind of how that looks from a practical standpoint. But again, just keeping in mind those sort of global scales. So that's federal, local, and global. Any questions on those? Those are the sort of the levels that we're dealing with. Okay. And again,
so I guess the international regulations that you just talked about.
You're not going to have to deal with these, probably.
The way you kind of phrased that was like, it seems like this is a way to just cover all your bases without going through any of the individual branches. Is that kind of right?
What do you mean by individual branches?
Well, it sounded like maybe Primus or this global initiative is there so that farmers and producers and processors don't have to panic about going through all of these like 35 different channels. Is that kind of right? Is that sort of what this exists for?
That was the hope, is that there would be one audit that everyone would accept, no matter what.
Okay.
Because you have different buyers, obviously, or some people don't, but a lot of people have multiple buyers, and if everyone's asking for a different audit, that was a problem, because then you're having to pay for those, it's time, etc. So the idea was to create one. GFSI was that one standard. Primus didn't want to be a part of that, and so they still have their own separate thing. So there's still those two out there. As far as what you're going to be doing, keep in mind that this is like really, really big scale, and sometimes it's hard to apply these bigger scale systems to smaller scale operations. So if you have a buyer that's asking for this, then certainly look into it.
Yeah.
But if you don't, then I know like a couple of people in Montana that are doing Harmonized Gap Plus, and it's only because their buyers are asking for it. And then keep in mind that this is the cost there's going to be a cost associated with getting these audits. So it's up to you about how you want to sort of make that decision. Okay, so just to reiterate, with all these regulations, you can totally create food that's local and still safe. And as long as you understand which regulations apply to you, which don't, and why, and you can tell someone, here's what I'm doing to comply with the ones that are relevant, then you'll be okay. I think that's it. Yeah. Questions? Anything you guys want to go deeper on? There's a couple points there that.
So is there a way to set up a meeting with someone like yourself or someone who really knows the system in and out to sit down and work through your individual situation?
Sure.
It's going through all of this, I'm thinking there's 2 or 3 that definitely apply, but then there's 10 or 15 that might apply. It's what? Mm-hmm. I've talked to a lot of people on the phones and emails, and then I've talked to farmers who have completely contradicted everything that I was told with, you call it started with the health department, and they branched off into you need to talk to these 7 different people. Talk to those 7 different people, and the list became 14. And then I go talk to some farmers, and they're like, that's all bureaucratic BS. None of that exists, or none of that's real. All you need is this one thing. And it's like, who do I actually need to go through to make sure I'm doing this right and doing it safe?
Yeah.
So is there a way that...
Yeah, I'd be happy to chat with you.
Awesome.
Yeah. Yeah, we can go through and look at the plan, and yeah.
Okay.
And that's what I do and I don't sell anything. My time or the templates that I make, it's all covered by grant work, so
Whoa.
Which is nice for
Sweet.
producers. Yeah. So I don't make more money when I meet with people. that's just what I do. Other questions?
Can you show us your cover slide that have the other organizations with whom you work?
Oh yeah, yep, and I can go through those really quick. So yeah, I mean, I work with the USDA in the sense that they have people who work here with them. The Local Food Safety Collaborative, they've funded a lot of my work looking at specifically, essentially needs that people have brought up. Producers have said, oh, I don't understand this, or we need to figure this out. Like this last year, there's been a big question about surface water quality and irrigation. So we took samples of surface water and tried to figure out what the bacterial levels actually were. We were always telling people like, well, they probably fluctuate kind of slowly throughout the season, and what we found is that they actually changed week to week by thousands of parts per million, like super fast, which is problematic and alarming. National Farmers Union also funds this type of work. Link Foods and Western Montana Growers Cooperative, those are two cooperatives, one's in Spokane, one's in Missoula, and they did the group gap programs. They've made some effort in terms of trying to implement food safety. And then Lake County Community Development Corporation, Jan Tusick, who is their grant writer, she's gotten a lot of grants and helps fund the work that's gone on here. And then they also have a food processing center. They would be a good resource for you to, because they have helped people write HACCP plans. They bring in people who are producing food into their food facility and help them write a HACCP plan and help them operate. And eventually a lot of folks actually sort of graduate out of their facility because it's not big enough at some point. But they're used to taking someone with an idea, implementing it as far as food safety, and then helping them if they want to at some point go out of that space. So yeah.
So you're like an independent consultant that's funded by these?
Yeah. My background is in growing produce, and then I started a soup company that made soup. So I was getting into, well, how do you produce something? So I just started learning about it and taking training myself, and then eventually people said, well, can you tell us what you have learned? So yeah, but my time is not something that I ever have to charge for, which is nice with growers and producers.
Can you repeat what you just said about water contamination levels of bacteria fluctuating?
Sure. Here. Yeah, let me pull it up for you.
So like, because I know you have to do like E. coli and coliform testing every 6 months or so.
Yeah, we can.
Would it be something worth looking into doing that more frequently? Is that what you're kind of saying? Is like, while you passed on this day, weeks later it could be different?
Oops. Yeah, let me just pull up the results, and I can give you a clear sense of what that looks like. So I'll just turn this off real quick for a sec. Sorry about the video. So these three colors represent different sites. Green is one farm, yellow is another farm, blue is another farm. This was that I predicted. These aren't actual results, I just made these up. This is what I figured would be the case, like maybe in spring runoff, your levels go up, things kind of fluctuate throughout the season. And that was the reality. This red line is your maximum single test that's allowed by the USDA. So everything above that is not ideal. What's interesting is you could take, and depending on the system you're under, you'll have specific requirements for how often and what to test for and things like that. USDA gap is 3 times per season. Beginning of, I mean, it depends on your operation, but what they say is beginning of irrigation, peak irrigation, and then harvest is when you want to test. And you're looking at parts per million of E. coli because it's a good indicator. And again, this is the maximum single test for that that's allowed. Well,
So this was surface water, not
yes, yeah.
not well water.
I've never seen well water above 0.
Okay.
So that's usually good. Surface water, some of these levels that are up high, there's mitigation strategies that you can implement if your levels are higher than ideal. There's steps you can take, but some of these are so high that even those are out of.
Like an RO system or something?
Yeah, that's like kind of the, I mean, treatment is sort of the end goal, but you can apply a time between irrigation and harvest, a die-off period. You can also, I mean, the first step they say is always re-inspect your system. See if you just have a broken line, or if you have, I mean, there's things that you can find that would be easier to fix. And then a treatment system is sort of your end option. And actually next year, through the Mission Mountain Food Enterprise Center, I've submitted a couple grants to look at how you implement that on a small farm, because paying $5,000 for a system isn't like, well, if I make $10,000 in microgreens a year, do I want to pay $5,000 for a treatment system and then pay, $500 to maintain it every year? So hopefully I'm going to look at implementing systems, what they cost, how to maintain them, and there'll be more information on that later on. But yeah, good question. Other questions? Okay, thanks.
I will say that the state's tried to do some FSMA and some cottage food classes and things, and I've gone to a lot of them over the years, but this is really helpful. And like
Good.
a really big overall picture. It's a lot to talk about.
Yeah. Yep.
Fit it in.
I mean, like I said, one of those regulations, you can do an 8-hour training on it. So
Do you have a business card or anything?
I usually just give people my phone number because people lose business cards. But you're welcome.